welcome you on this platform, and in this video I'll be discussing a recent report that has been released by SBI, and this report is EcoRap. And this report, when we are talking about SBI EcoRap report of March 2026, it says that there are important factors which will lead to inflation in India, and ultimately that poses the threat to the RBI's target of 4% of the inflation that is there. Now, when it comes to this report factors that there are two important reasons for the increase of the inflation that we will see, and these factors are: number one, that is there is a probability of the El Niño that will be there, and we all know that the El Niño season, it leads to drought-like conditions, and also there is already ongoing geopolitical tensions that are there, and both of these factors, and also cumulatively we have another third factor also that leads to a global shock, and also it will lead to a very prominent shock to the Indian economy. Now, the first factor, like I said, is the geopolitics conflict that is ongoing in the West Asia, and that has threatened the Strait of Hormuz choke point. Now, because of this, the oil supply had been disrupted, and ultimately the average crude prices, they are moving ahead, and they have reached even up to $120 per barrel. At the same time, the another factor that has been featured in this report is the El Niño that could be there. Now, because of the El Niño, what will happen is that 40 to 60% chances are there, probability is there that there is an evolving El Niño that will disrupt the southwest monsoon in mid 2026, and ultimately the climate risk ultimately is that will disrupt 60% of the complete agriculture in India. At the same time, there is the economic strain as well because of the looming or the ongoing geopolitical tension in the West Asia, and that is creating an economic strain. The rupee is breaching 92 rupees per dollar mark amid the portfolio outflows that are there, and also our import costs are rising, that is creating a strain on the current account deficit as well. So ultimately, these are the factors which had been featured in the SBI report that says that because of these factors, the inflation will rise in the Indian economy. And ultimately over here, the energy geopolitics dimension is that we all know that we are, when it comes to the oil import, we are dependent upon the oil imports for about 85 to 90% of the oil that is required. And ultimately, because of the war that is looming on between US, Israel and Iran, there is the choke point, that is Strait of Hormuz, and this choke point had been the trade had been disrupted because of this war that is there. So the trigger is that the Strait of Hormuz had been disruption. There had been disruption because of the supply blockages, and ultimately, the freight rates, the supply or the maritime freight rates have risen. And the first order impact had been that there is a direct fuel inflation via the crude oil that had been there. There had been constrained LNG supplies as well, and ultimately the oil and the LNG prices, they are rising all throughout the economy, and this will create the cascading impact, and the cost escalation will be there in the terms of logistics, in the terms of petrochemicals, and even for the fertilizer production because of the constraint that we will see in the supply of oil as well as LNG imports. And ultimately there is the urgent requirement that is required for operationalization and also to expand the strategic petroleum reserve that we have in India currently. So this is the first factor that we are discussing. The second factor I told you is the climate and agriculture threat. I have told you that there is the possibility, 60 to 70% possibility that we will have El Niño in mid 2026 season, and that will disrupt the complete monsoon cycle. And not only this, not only the El Niño factor, we have El Niño factor that is there, and along with El Niño there would be negative IOD or negative Indian Ocean Dipole, and both of them combinedly will disrupt the complete monsoon cycle in India, and we can have drought in the upcoming days because the southwest monsoon will be disrupted heavily. So ultimately that will lead to a direct threat to the rain-fed. We have kharif crops, like for example we have rices, pulses and oilseeds, and there will be overall reduction in the yields despite that we have the wheat average that have increased. At the same time, it will lead to inflation because the food comprises of about 40% of India's the consumer price index basket, and ultimately the weak harvest, they would spike the food prices by about 6 to 10%. At the same time, there will be distress in the rural areas because there will be the rural incomes that will be strained, impacted very severely, and that will dampen the discretionary consumption, that is for the FMCG companies or the tractor or the two-wheelers. So ultimately when the income will get, it will get reduced. So there would be less of the spending in the rural regions as well. We have a buffer resilience where we hold the rice stocks that are at 12 times the buffer norm, providing a critical buffer and the resilient capacity to India. But it is finite and it is a defense that is against the immediate starvation in India. So that is a positive point that we can see over here. At the same time, because of the geopolitics tension that is going on in the West Asia, there is the balance of payment crisis that is looming over India. There is widening deficit because we are paying in the dollars, and ultimately the elevated oil prices, they are projecting to the current account deficit that is widening, and it is rising from 1% to about 1.7 to 3.1% of the GDP. At the same time, there would be a fiscal strain because there would be higher fertilizer and fuel subsidy burdens that will be there on the government of India, and ultimately that will threaten the fiscal deficit target of 4.5% of the deficit or of the fiscal deficit that is there, or the GDP. At the same time, there is massive portfolio outflows combined with the weak foreign direct investment right now in India, and that is adding a severe pressure to our forex or the foreign exchange reserves. At the same time, when it comes to the inflation, there is an imported inflation that would be there because of the weaker rupee, which is approaching about 94 rupees per dollar, and it will amplify the cost of all the imports that are there in India, and it will multiply the effects of the high global commodity prices. So this is the complete depreciation trap that we are moving into. That is, there are rising oil prices and there is the increased dollar demand as well in the economy, global economy, and that is leading to rupee depreciation, which is again leading to higher import cost, and there is a wider trade deficit that we are seeing in the upcoming days. Now over here, these are the three types of shock that the Indian economy will have to see in the upcoming days. The first shock is the conflict that is there in West Asia and the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. Ultimately, there is the freight cost as well as the imported fuel that would be, that will increase, and ultimately that will lead to green transition, and even the strategic petroleum reserves have to be strengthened in India. So this is basically the positive outcome that we will see in the upcoming days. At the same time, there is a climate shock of the El Nino as well as negative Indian Ocean dipole that will lead to drop in the agriculture output or the yield, and also it will lead to the rural distress in the upcoming days, and we have to look forward for the buffer stocks and also for the agri-tech that should be there. At the same time, the third of the shock is the currency shock, and ultimately because of this shock there are dollar outflows, there is trade deficit that is going on, and that is leading to overall imports current account deficit that is getting more and more costlier, and current account deficit is getting widened, and there has to be a foreign reserve intervention and the FDI push that we will have to look forward to manage the shock of the currency that we are seeing right now. Alright, so these are the three important shocks to the Indian economy that we are going to see in the upcoming days. Now ultimately, because of these shocks, there would be the supply chain that will get constrained, and also there would be sectoral impact as well. Now when it comes to the fertilizers, we know that the fertilizers, they use the LNG very much. They depend upon the imported gas we depend on the imported gas for the manufacturing of the fertilizers. So what will happen is that the fertilizers, which are key input for the agriculture, ultimately the production will get disrupted and it will threaten the crop yields globally and even in India. But at the same time, we know that there is a threat to the agriculture because of the El Nino and the negative Indian Ocean dipole. So ultimately this becomes even a greater threat because the fertilizers yield will decrease. At the same time, when it comes to the aviation and transport, the aviation turbine fuel or the ATF, it is getting costlier, and we know that all the airlines, they have increased their rates. At the same time, diesel have spiked immediately, and that is compressing the operating margins for the logistics as well, and we will see that the transportation cost will increase all over, and ultimately when the transportation cost increase, that will lead to the cost push factor for the inflation in India as well. At the same time, when it comes to the manufacturing input costs rise, they will rise because of the metals, because of the plastic, and ultimately that will lead to margin compression or delayed capacity expansion as well. Alright, there would be high summer temperatures, they will boost the AC sales, but overall inflation forces households to delay the discretionary spending as well. Now, there are third order anomalies as well, like for example, there had been disruptions like for the helium, and that have directly threatened this semiconductor manufacturing in India as well. And also the healthcare, like for example, we use them for the MRI machines. So ultimately, these are the impacts that we will see in the upcoming days, and some of them we are already witnessing it right now. Now, we all know that the RBI or the Reserve Bank of India, through its monetary policy, it can impact the inflation and it can manage the inflation, but at the same time, there are certain threats to it as well. Now, when it comes to the inflation control, the mandate is that RBI wants to keep the target to 4% plus 2 minus 2% of the consumer price index, and it is heavily tested over here when we have three different of the shocks that the Indian economy will be witnessing in the upcoming days. One shock we are already witnessing, and because of it we have the another shock as well, geopolitical crisis and also the currency shock. Both of them we are witnessing right now. But if the El Niño will strike India, there will be a third shock as well, and ultimately there it will be pertinent to see what the RBI will do to keep the inflation target at 4% plus minus 2% of the consumer price index, and ultimately this would be heavily tested. Alright, inflation is projected to cross 5.5 to 7% under the crude pressure. At the same time, current inflation is basically supply driven, and it is because of the oil and the climate crisis that we will be witnessing in the future. The rate hikes, they will destroy the demand, but they cannot fix the supply bottlenecks over here. At the same time, when it comes to RBI, if the RBI will cut the rates, alright, it will cut the rates. So what will happen is that will lead to, or that will stimulate the GDP. There will be growth of the economy, but at the same time that will also worsen inflation, because if the rates will be cut, there would be more money flow in the economy, and then because of the more money flow, the rates will rise more higher, and that will lead to inflation. So RBI, if it will cut the rates, that will stimulate the GDP, but it will worsen the inflation, and also there would be rupee depreciation that will be there. At the same time, if the rate hikes are defended, so then what will happen is the rupee, but it will stimulate, or what will happen is that if there are rate cuts that are there, so ultimately because of the rate hikes, because of the rate cuts, there would be growth that will be there. But in the case of rate hikes, there will be inflation control, but at the same time, the economy will stagnate. There will be no growth in the economy in terms of GDP. Alright, and at the same time, we have rising oil prices, that is there. And for the oil prices, we have the oil marketing companies. If the oil marketing companies, they will absorb the oil prices, so what will happen? They will get overburdened and they will bleed. Alright, and if the government cuts the excise, so ultimately that widens the fiscal deficit. So there is a balance that is required when it comes to the monetary policy as well as the cuts, or the oil prices, who absorb the oil prices or who cuts the excise duties as well. Now over here, although this complete scenario is quite grim, and ultimately that shows a negative phase that in which we are entering, but at the same time this also has certain silver lining to India as well, because when it comes to the situation that we are witnessing right now, so what we are doing is we are transitioning, or we should transition from the passive crisis management to the proactive systemic self-reliance or towards Atmanirbhar Bharat. And for this, what we need to do is we need to move forward for the energy sovereignty, where we must aggressively shift towards the nuclear energy, towards solar energy, towards hydropower projects, green hydrogen, and also expand our strategic petroleum reserve that we have. At the same time, we must look forward for the agriculture resilience, where we must promote the climate smart agriculture. All right, we must promote the climate smart agriculture, where we must move towards the dry land farming as well. We must grow the millets. We must diversify our crops that are suitable to the climate, or we can use the agroclimatic zones for promoting the right type of the crops in India. At the same time, micro irrigation and decentralization of the cold storage grids has to be done. All right, these are the positive steps that we can take to combat this type of shocks in the near future. All right. At the same time, there has to be import substitution, where we should deepen the PLI schemes for the electronic components and active pharmaceutical ingredients, so that we can protect our trade deficit that is there. And also, we must look forward for the financial independence, where we should internationalize the rupee to settle the trade directly. We must get into the bilateral agreements, where we must pay in the rupee instead of the US dollar, as well as we should reduce the exposure to US dollar fluctuations as well. So these are the things that we can look forward, and these are the steps that India can take moving ahead and ultimately becoming resilient for any such kind of shocks to the economy in the near future. So that is all in today's session. Thank you very much, guys, for joining me over here. Please do not forget to like the session, share the session with your friends, and subscribe for more such future updates. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care and Jai Hind.